She walked into that hearing room with the confidence of someone who had never truly lost in front of a camera. She had the Twitter following. She had the magazine covers. She had the crowd chants and the viral moments and the documentary film crews following her every move through the marble hallways of the United States Capitol. She had everything a modern political star is supposed to have. What she did not have, as she settled into the witness chair that morning and smiled at the C-SPAN cameras positioned around the room, was any real idea of what was about to happen to her. Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana was already seated at the raised dais when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez entered the hearing room. He was shuffling papers slowly, unhurriedly, the way a man does when he has all the time in the world and knows exactly how everything is going to unfold. He was wearing one of his rumpled suits. His silver hair was combed, but not perfectly. He looked, as he always looked, like someone's retired grandfather who had somehow wandered into the United States Senate and was doing his best to keep up with all the complicated things the young people were talking about these days. He glanced up when she entered. He smiled warmly. He looked back down at his papers. There was nothing threatening in that smile, nothing sharp behind those eyes, nothing in his entire demeanor that suggested anything other than a kindly older man who wanted to have a friendly conversation about policy. That was the trap. That had always been the trap, and she walked straight into it. The Senate Budget Committee hearing had been called to examine the scope and feasibility of the Green New Deal, the sweeping legislative proposal that had become the signature achievement of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's young political career. It was the proposal that had made her a hero to millions of progressives, a villain to millions of conservatives, and a genuine phenomenon to millions of Americans who were simply trying to figure out what to make of this bartender from the Bronx who had arrived in Washington and immediately started talking about transforming the entire American economy in a decade. The Green New Deal promised a complete overhaul of how America produced energy, built its buildings, grew its food, moved its people, and organized its economic life. It was sweeping in ambition. It was visionary in scope. And it was, to anyone who looked carefully at the details, remarkably vague about a number of rather important questions. Questions like how much it would cost. Questions like where the money would come from. Questions like how, precisely, any of this would work in practice. Senator John Kennedy had been looking at those questions for a long time. That morning, he had spent several hours in his Senate office with his senior policy staff going through every public statement Ocasio-Cortez had ever made about the Green New Deal. They had gone through the resolution text itself, the accompanying fact sheet that her office had released and then quietly deleted, the television interviews, the town halls, the viral videos, the Twitter threads, the Instagram live streams. They had compiled what Kennedy called his list of simple questions, not trick questions, not obscure policy minutiae designed to trap someone on a technicality. Simple, direct, foundational questions that any person proposing the largest economic transformation in American history ought to be able to answer in their sleep. What does it cost? How do you pay for it? Where does the electricity come from if you eliminate fossil fuels? How do tax breaks actually work? How is unemployment calculated? These were not hard questions. They were not advanced questions. They were, in the most literal sense of the phrase, the basics. And Kennedy had spent enough years in hearing rooms watching witnesses crumble under the weight of the basics to know exactly what was going to happen when he started asking them. He had not always been a senator. Before he had represented Louisiana in the United States Senate, John Kennedy had been a lawyer, a very good lawyer. He had studied at Oxford on a Rhodes Scholarship, at the time an honor granted to only the most exceptional students in the country. He had earned his law degree from the University of Virginia, one of the finest law schools in America. He had spent decades in courtrooms and in legal proceedings of every kind, developing and refining the particular skill set that would eventually make him one of the most feared questioners in the history of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and when the occasion called for it, the Senate Budget Committee. He had learned, through years of practice, the single most important lesson about cross-examination, that the most devastating questions are never the complicated ones. The most devastating questions are the simple ones, The ones that sound so easy, so obvious, so basic that the witness almost feels insulted being asked them. The ones where the witness thinks, surely this is beneath me to answer. Surely everyone in the room already knows the answer to this. The ones where the witness, in the grip of that dismissive overconfidence, realizes too late that they do not actually know the answer. That is when the trap closes. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had prepared, in her own way, for this hearing. She had been preparing for weeks, in the sense that she had been speaking publicly about the Green New Deal for months, and had a well-developed set of talking points about climate change, about moral urgency, about the cost of inaction, about the historical precedents for large-scale government investment in transformation, about the New Deal of the 1930s and the space program and the interstate highway system. She knew her arguments. She believed in her arguments. She had delivered versions of those arguments to enormous crowds in packed auditoriums and town halls, and had watched people cry and cheer and rise to their feet. She was, by any reasonable measure, an extraordinarily effective political communicator. She was not, and this distinction would matter enormously in the next hour, an extraordinarily effective policy analyst. There is a difference between those two things, a large and important difference. The skill of making people feel the emotional weight of a problem is not the same skill as understanding the technical mechanics of a solution. The gift for inspiring people to believe that change is possible is not the same gift as knowing what that change actually requires and how much it costs, and where the money comes from, and what happens when the implementation details run into the unmovable arithmetic of a federal budget. Ocasio-Cortez had the first set of skills in abundance. The second set was, at that particular moment in her career, considerably less developed. The hearing room was settled and quiet when Senator Kennedy was recognized for his 5 minutes of questioning. 200 people filled the room, journalists with notebooks, staffers with laptops, lobbyists from every conceivable corner of the American economy, citizens who had obtained gallery passes and were watching with the slightly awed expression of people who have never before attended a Senate hearing and are not quite sure what to expect. The C-SPAN cameras held their positions. The wood paneling absorbed the ambient sound. The portraits of former committee chairs looked down from the walls with the stern, humorless expressions of men who have sat through a great many hearings and are not easily impressed. Kennedy took his time. He shuffled his papers one more time. He glanced at his notes. He cleared his throat gently, the way you clear your throat when you are not nervous at all but want to create the impression of a man who is slightly nervous, slightly out of his depth, slightly in need of the patience and generosity of the brilliant young witness in front of him. He looked up. He smiled his grandfatherly smile. He spoke in his Louisiana drawl, slow and warm and thick as bayou water, each word settling into the room like it had nowhere else to be. "Ms. Ocasio-Cortez," he said, "thank you so very much for taking the time to be here today. I really appreciate it. I know you are a very busy person and this committee is grateful for your willingness to testify." He paused. "I have been reading about your Green New Deal proposal and I have to say it is a mighty ambitious piece of work. Transforming the entire American economy, rebuilding every building in the country, moving to zero emissions in 10 years, getting rid of fossil fuels. That is quite an undertaking." He tilted his head slightly, the expression of a man who is genuinely impressed and slightly bewildered in equal measure. "I hope you can help me understand some of this, because I am just a simple country lawyer from Louisiana, and some of it is a bit over my head, but I am trying to wrap my mind around the scope of what we are talking about." He leaned forward slightly, his elbows on the desk, his expression open and curious. "So I guess my first question is just this. What does all of this cost? Just a ballpark, just a rough figure so I can start to understand the scale of what we are being asked to support." In the gallery, a young staffer leaned over to the person beside her and whispered that it seemed like a pretty easy opening question. The person beside her, a journalist who had covered Kennedy for several years, said nothing and wrote something in their notebook and waited. Ocasio-Cortez smiled. She had been waiting for a question like this. It was, in a sense, the question she had been preparing for, except that she had been preparing for a version of it that went slightly differently. She had been preparing for a hostile version, a dismissive version, a version delivered with contempt and condescension. Kennedy's version was gentle. It was friendly. It seemed almost like an invitation rather than a challenge. And so she launched into her answer with confidence, with passion, with the rhetorical energy of someone who has delivered this speech 100 times to enthusiastic audiences and expects this audience to be enthusiastic as well. She talked about the cost of inaction. She talked about the economic devastation of unaddressed climate change, the floods and droughts and wildfires and rising sea levels, the disrupted agricultural systems, and the displaced communities, and the infrastructure damage that would dwarf any investment in prevention. She talked about this not as an expense but as an investment, a down payment on a livable future. She talked about the jobs that would be created, the industries that would be born, the American workers who would be employed building the clean energy economy of the 21st century. She was eloquent. She was passionate. She was, in her way, genuinely moving. Kennedy waited. When she paused to take a breath, he leaned forward again. He held up one hand gently, not interrupting exactly, more like a man who is trying to flag down a passing car. "Ma'am," he said, his voice gentle, "I appreciate all of that. I really do. Climate change is serious and nobody here is saying it isn't. But I asked a simpler question if you don't mind. What does your plan cost?" He began counting on his fingers slowly, one at a time, the gesture of a man thinking through a math problem out loud. "You have proposed transforming the entire American economy. You have asked us to consider supporting this proposal. You must have some idea of the numbers we are talking about. Is it $10 trillion, 20 trillion, 50 trillion? Just help me understand the ballpark." The room had gotten quieter. Not silent yet, but quieter. The kind of quiet that starts to gather when people sense that something is happening that requires their full attention. Ocasio-Cortez shifted slightly in her chair. "The costs," she said, "have not been fully calculated yet because we are still in the proposal phase. Different economists have made different estimates depending on their underlying assumptions and the specific policy choices that would need to be made during implementation." "So you don't know," Kennedy said. He said it gently. He said it without any edge of mockery, without any trace of contempt. He said it the way a teacher might say it to a student who has given a long and earnest answer that does not quite address the question. "That is what I am hearing. You have proposed transforming the entire American economy, but you cannot tell us what it costs. Is that accurate?" "I am saying the estimates vary widely," she said. "But you don't have a number." Kennedy's smile had not moved. His voice had not hardened. But something in the room had shifted, very slightly, the way air pressure shifts before a storm, and the people who had been in enough hearing rooms could feel it. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," Kennedy said. He was still leaning forward, still wearing that expression of patient curiosity. "You want to rebuild every building in America. You want to replace every car with an electric vehicle. You want to completely transform how we generate electricity. You want to change how we do agriculture. You are asking the American people and their elected representatives to support this massive, unprecedented transformation of the entire economy. And when I ask what it costs, you don't have an answer." He paused. He let the pause sit. He let it breathe. Outside the tall windows of the hearing room, Washington was going about its ordinary business, the traffic and the tourists and the machinery of the federal government grinding forward, indifferent to the quiet drama unfolding inside this wood-paneled room. Inside, 200 people sat very still. "Ma'am," Kennedy continued, "when I go to the hardware store back home in Louisiana and I tell them I want to renovate my house, you know what the first thing they ask me is? They ask me what my budget is. Because you can't renovate a house without knowing what you can afford to spend. And I would think that before you propose the biggest economic transformation in the entire history of the American Republic, you might want to figure out what it costs." Ocasio-Cortez's cheeks had developed a faint color that had not been there when she entered the room. "Senator," she said, "with all due respect, the climate crisis demands bold action, and we cannot allow concerns about cost to prevent us from doing what needs to be done." "I'm not trying to prevent anything," Kennedy said, his voice remaining gentle, remaining warm, remaining infuriatingly polite. I'm just trying to understand what we are being asked to support. He glanced at his notes. Multiple think tanks have studied this proposal. The estimates they have come up with range from about $50 trillion to $93 trillion over 10 years. That is what the studies say. But you have dismissed those estimates as not being the point. So I am asking you, what is the cost? Not what a think tank says. What do you say? You proposed this. You wrote it. What does it cost? The silence that followed lasted several seconds. Several very long seconds during which everyone in the room, everyone watching the C-SPAN feed, everyone who would eventually watch the clip online understood, with complete and unavoidable clarity, that she did not have an answer. She had passion. She had conviction. She had the moral weight of an urgent cause behind her and the rhetorical gifts to communicate that cause with genuine power. She did not have a number. She did not have a spreadsheet. She did not have the thing that a person who is proposing to spend somewhere between $50 and $93 trillion of the American people's money is supposed to have when they sit down in front of a Senate committee and ask those people to take them seriously. Kennedy let the silence sit for one beat longer than was strictly necessary. Then he nodded once slowly and moved on. "Let me ask you about something else," he said, his voice shifting to an even warmer register, as if the previous exchange had been a pleasant detour and he was now ready to get back to the main road. "Something that has been in the news and that I have been trying to understand. Amazon wanted to build their second headquarters in New York City. I believe they said they would bring 25,000 jobs. Good-paying jobs, from what I heard. Jobs in technology and logistics and operations. Jobs that pay considerably more than the median wage in New York City. And you opposed that deal, and eventually Amazon decided to go elsewhere. Can you walk me through your thinking on that? I am just trying to understand the economics of turning down 25,000 good jobs." Ocasio-Cortez straightened in her seat. This was territory she felt more confident on. This had been one of the defining moments of her early political career, one of the fights that had established her reputation as someone willing to stand up to corporate power, to refuse the conventional wisdom that any deal that brought jobs and money to a city was automatically a good deal. She had a whole argument. She had a whole story. Amazon, she said, was asking for nearly $3 billion in tax breaks and subsidies. $3 billion of public money that could have been better invested in our communities, in education, in affordable housing, in infrastructure that benefits everyone and not just one corporation. Instead of giving that money to one of the wealthiest companies and one of the wealthiest men in the world, we could have used those resources to build up the city in ways that would benefit all New Yorkers. Kennedy was nodding along. He was nodding the way a man nods when he is following an argument carefully, when he wants the person making the argument to know that he is paying close attention and taking it seriously. So the tax breaks could have been better spent. That is what you said at the time, essentially, that this money could be spent on other things. Yes, she said, exactly. Help me understand that, Kennedy said. He leaned forward again. He picked up his pen. Tax breaks, he said slowly, that is when the government agrees not to collect taxes it would otherwise collect, correct? You are agreeing not to collect certain taxes in exchange for some benefit, some investment, some jobs, some economic activity. That is what a tax break is. You are foregoing revenue you would otherwise have collected. Yes, she said. So that money, Kennedy continued, the $3 billion we are talking about, that is money that the city would have agreed not to collect in property taxes or income taxes or whatever the specific mechanism was over some number of years. It is not money sitting in an account somewhere that somebody could write a check from. It is money that would not exist as revenue if Amazon came, and would also not exist as revenue if Amazon did not come. Is that right? He was still speaking gently. He was still wearing the expression of a man trying to work through a complicated idea and needing help. There was a pause. The city would not have been giving away $3 billion that could otherwise be used for, she began. That is not what I asked, Kennedy said. He said it softly. He said it without any sharpness, without any edge. He said it the way you might gently redirect a student who has started answering a different question than the one you asked. I asked a simpler question. If Amazon does not come to New York, Does the city have $3 billion to spend on schools or housing or infrastructure? Yes or no? The pause stretched. The tax structure would be different, she said. Yes or no, Kennedy said. Simple question. If Amazon does not build their headquarters in New York, does the city of New York have $3 billion that it can spend on other things? The silence that followed was not the comfortable silence of a person considering their answer. It was the uncomfortable silence of a person who has just realized, in real time, in front of 200 people and a national television audience, that their entire understanding of a thing they have been talking about publicly for years might have been wrong. No, she said finally, quietly. No, Kennedy repeated. He said it without triumph. He said it without any expression of satisfaction or pleasure. He said it the way a teacher says something when a student has finally arrived at the correct answer after some struggle, patient and affirming. Because, see, I think there has been some confusion about how tax breaks work. A tax break is not money that exists somewhere that you can choose to spend on something else. It is money that would not be collected in the first place. It is a promise to forego future revenue in exchange for some benefit. If the company does not come, you do not get that revenue anyway. You do not have money to spend. You have nothing. Does that make sense? Ocasio-Cortez looked as though she wanted to make a larger argument, a structural argument, an argument about corporate power and the political economy of tax incentives. Senator, she said, the point is that Amazon was asking for corporate welfare while our communities were starving for investment. Let's do some simple math together, Kennedy said. He actually pulled out a notepad and a pen. He held the pen poised over the paper like a man settling in to work through an arithmetic problem at the kitchen table. Amazon said they would bring $27 billion in economic activity over time. The tax breaks were worth $3 billion, so that is $27 billion minus $3 billion. He wrote on the paper. What does that equal? A pause. $24 billion, she said. $24 billion, Kennedy repeated, and he wrote the number on his notepad and underlined it. That is how much New York would have gained, even after accounting for the tax breaks. $24 billion in economic activity, 25,000 jobs, tax revenue flowing into city coffers for years and decades. He paused, but Amazon left. He put his pen down. So how much does New York get now? He waited. He waited the way a lawyer waits when he knows the answer and wants the witness to say it. Nothing, she said. Zero, Kennedy said. He wrote a large zero on his notepad and held it up briefly, not theatrically, almost matter-of-factly, the gesture of a man completing a calculation. You turned $24 billion into zero, 25,000 good jobs into zero, years of tax revenue into zero, and you did it because you believed that tax breaks were money sitting in a bank account that could be spent somewhere else. You have an economics degree from Boston University, right? Very prestigious institution. And they did not teach you the difference between tax breaks and government spending. The room was very quiet, not the polite quiet of an audience waiting for the next thing to happen. The breathless quiet of people who have just watched something unexpected happen and are not quite sure what to do with what they have seen. Kennedy's voice became, if anything, even gentler. Ma'am, he said, I am just a simple lawyer from Louisiana, but even I know that $24 billion is better than zero. Those were real jobs for real families, real tax revenue for New York schools and parks and subway system, real economic activity that would have rippled through the entire city economy. And you opposed it because you did not understand the basic mechanics of how tax breaks work. Those families who would have had those jobs, those 25,000 people who would have been earning good salaries and building careers and paying taxes and spending money in local businesses, they are not better off because of that decision. New York is not better off, but perhaps you felt good about it. And perhaps, in the world you operate in, feeling good about something is what matters most. He shuffled his papers. Let's move on, he said. He looked at his notes for a moment. He appeared to be searching for his next question, though everyone in the room by this point understood perfectly well that Kennedy had his next question already prepared and had had it prepared for hours, and was simply creating the impression of a man working through his notes. He glanced up, his expression brightening as if he had just remembered something. Oh, I wanted to ask you about something else. Something that has been bothering me. I believe I heard you say at one point that unemployment is low because everyone has two jobs. Did I hear that right? Ocasio-Cortez's expression shifted. That statement has been taken out of context, she said. What I meant was, and the larger point I was trying to make about wages and the cost of living was. Did you say it? Kennedy asked. Simply, directly. I am not asking about context yet. I am just asking whether you made that statement, whether those words came out of your mouth. Did you say that unemployment is low because everyone has two jobs? Yes, she said, but the point I was making. Let me just understand the math on that first, Kennedy said. He actually reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket and produced a small calculator. He set it on the desk in front of him with the unhurried gesture of a man who has brought the right tool for the job. If I have two jobs, how many times am I counted in the unemployment statistics? Once, she said. She could see where this was going. She had been able to see where it was going from the moment he asked the question. Once, Kennedy repeated. Just once. If Senator Collins over there has two jobs, she is counted once in the unemployment data. If every person in this room has two jobs, they are each counted exactly once. So having two jobs does not make the unemployment rate look lower. That is not how the Bureau of Labor Statistics calculates unemployment. If you work at one place in the morning and another place in the evening, you are one employed person with two jobs, not two employed people. The number of jobs a person holds does not affect whether that person is counted as employed or unemployed. The broader point I was making, Ocasio-Cortez said, was about wages and economic precarity, about the fact that people are having to work multiple jobs just to afford basic expenses. That is the real economic story that the unemployment number conceals. I understand that may have been your broader point, Kennedy said, and I am not unsympathetic to the concern about wages. That is a real issue. But your statement was specifically about unemployment. You said unemployment is low because people have two jobs. Those were your words. And that statement is mathematically impossible. It cannot be true. It is not how unemployment is measured. Do you understand why? I misspoke, she said. Everyone makes mistakes. That is absolutely fair, Kennedy said, nodding with apparent generosity. Everyone does make mistakes. I make mistakes. My colleagues make mistakes. But ma'am, you have an economics degree from Boston University. Your family invested, based on current tuition rates at that institution, somewhere in the range of $200,000 or more in that education. And you do not know how unemployment statistics are calculated. That is not misspeaking in the sense of choosing the wrong word. That is not knowing something that is fundamental to economic analysis. And that concerns me. It concerns me because you are in the United States Congress. You are proposing enormous, sweeping changes to the American economy. If you do not know how unemployment is calculated, how can we have confidence in your understanding of the economic effects of the policies you are proposing? Senator Ocasio-Cortez said, and there was now an edge in her voice, an edge of frustration, of anger barely held in check. I think it is becoming clear that you are not interested in a genuine policy conversation. You are interested in making me look bad. Kennedy raised his hand gently. I'm not trying to make you look bad, he said. I'm asking you to explain statements you made. You made a statement about unemployment that was factually incorrect. I asked you to explain it. If you cannot explain it, that is not something I have done to you. That is a reflection of the accuracy of your original statement. He glanced at his notes. I have still got a couple of minutes. Let's keep going. He moved to his next topic without pausing, without giving her time to regroup or recover her composure or settle back into the confident authority she had carried into the room with her when she walked through the door that morning. You support Medicare for all, he said. Is that correct? Health care is a human right, she said. Every American deserves access to quality medical care regardless of their income or their employment status. I believe that absolutely, and I will continue to fight for it. I agree that health care matters enormously, Kennedy said, cutting off what might have been a longer statement. But let's talk about the economics, because that is what we are here to discuss today. Various studies have estimated that Medicare for all would cost approximately $32 trillion over 10 years. That is roughly $3.2 trillion per year. How do we pay for that? Ocasio-Cortez launched into her answer with practiced efficiency, taxing the wealthy and large corporations, eliminating the overhead and profit extracted by private insurance companies, modeling the funding mechanisms used by other developed countries that have achieved universal health care coverage, redirecting current government spending on Medicare, Medicaid, and other programs toward a unified system. Kennedy listened. He nodded. He held up his hand. "Let me just stop you there for a moment," he said, "and let's do some math together, because I think math is helpful here." He picked up his pen and his notepad again. "All of the billionaires in the United States combined," he said, "all of them, every single person in this country with 10 figures or more in net worth, their total combined wealth is approximately $4.6 trillion. If we confiscated every penny, every single cent of their wealth, which we could only do once because then they would have nothing left, we would have $4.6 trillion. But Medicare for all costs $32 trillion over 10 years. So we have $4.6 trillion toward a $32 trillion bill. Where does the other $27.4 trillion come from? We would not be relying solely on taxing billionaires," she said. "Corporate taxes, wealth taxes on the very wealthy, eliminating subsidies and tax expenditures for industries that do not need them." Kennedy was nodding. "But ma'am," he said, his voice remaining gentle even as his point became sharper, "even if we taxed every corporation in America at 100% of their profits, meaning they kept nothing, they worked entirely for the government, $0 of profit retained. And even if we taxed every single person making over $100,000 a year at 100% of their income above that threshold, meaning they worked for free beyond their first 100,000, we still could not pay for this. The math does not work. I'm not trying to be difficult and I'm not trying to score political points. I'm just asking a simple arithmetic question. $32 trillion. Where does it come from? Real numbers, not talking points." "Other countries make it work," she said. "Canada, the United Kingdom, Germany, France. Every other major developed country in the world manages to provide universal health care coverage, and they do it for less per capita than we currently spend. Other countries are not the United States," Kennedy said. He began counting on his fingers again, that slow, deliberate gesture of a man working through a list. "Other countries do not have our population. They do not have our geography. They do not maintain the defense commitments that allow those other countries to spend less on their own defense. They have different existing health care infrastructure and different baseline health outcomes and different systems of medical education and hospital organization. And most importantly, I am not asking about other countries. I am asking about your plan for America. Where does the $32 trillion come from? Show me the math. The details would need to be worked out in the legislative process," she said. "The details," Kennedy repeated. He said the word slowly. He let it sit in the air. "Ma'am," he said, "the cost is not a detail. The cost is arguably the single most important thing. You are proposing the largest expansion of government spending in American history. You are asking us to restructure an industry that represents nearly 20% of the entire American economy. And when I ask how you plan to pay for it, you tell me the details need to be worked out." He paused. "That is like me going to the bank and telling them I want to borrow money to buy a house, and when they ask how I plan to make the payments, I tell them the payment details need to be worked out. The bank would not give me that loan. Why should the American people give you $32 trillion before you have figured out how to pay it back?" His time was running short. He could see the clock on the wall of the hearing room. He had perhaps 90 seconds left. He did not hurry. "I want to observe something," he said. "Something I have noticed over the course of this conversation. When I asked about the Green New Deal, you could not tell me what it costs. When I asked about the Amazon decision, you revealed that you did not understand the difference between tax breaks and government spending. When I asked about your unemployment statement, you could not explain how unemployment is actually calculated. When I asked about Medicare for all, you could not show me how to pay for it." He paused. "There is a pattern here, and it concerns me." He moved without transition to his final question. "You have been in Congress for approximately 3 years," he said. "What major legislation have you passed into law?" Ocasio-Cortez looked momentarily caught off balance by the change in direction. "I have introduced important legislation," she said. "I have shifted the national conversation on climate change and economic inequality. I have brought visibility to issues that were previously ignored by the political mainstream. I have." "I asked what you have passed," Kennedy said. "Bills that became law. Legislation that went through committee, passed in the House, passed in the Senate, was signed by the President, and is now the law of the land. Major accomplishments. What is your list?" The Green New Deal has fundamentally changed how we discuss and think about climate policy in this country. The Green New Deal received 0 votes in the United States Senate, Kennedy said. When it was brought up for a procedural vote, not a single senator, not one Democrat, voted for it. In the House, your own party's leadership would not bring it to the floor for a vote because they understood it would fail. That is not passed legislation. That is a failed proposal. What else? She talked about amendments she had offered to other bills, about hearings where her questioning had shaped the public record, about raising awareness of crucial issues that had not received sufficient media attention, about changing the terms of political debate in ways that would eventually translate into legislative action. Kennedy listened. He waited until she finished. Then he spoke. "Ma'am," he said, "raising awareness is what social media influencers do. You are a member of the United States Congress. The job of Congress is to pass laws. That is the constitutional function of this body. Write legislation, move it through committee, pass it in the House, work with the Senate. Get it signed into law. That is the job. That is what you were elected to do. How many bills have you gotten through that process?" He already knew the answer. Everyone in the room knew the answer. The answer was visible in the silence that followed his question, in the way she paused and gathered herself and tried to find something to say that would not confirm what the silence was already saying. 3 years in Congress, Kennedy said. And his voice had changed now very slightly, the grandfather quality still present, but underneath it something else, something that might have been described as a quiet and absolute seriousness. 0 major legislation passed into law, millions of Twitter followers, enormous media attention, a documentary, magazine covers, one of the most famous members of Congress in the country, and 0 major laws. He paused. Tweeting is not the same as legislating. Being famous is not the same as being effective, and Twitter popularity is not the same as governing competence. He gathered his papers. He glanced at the chairman. "Mr. Chairman, I believe I am out of time, but I appreciate Ms. Ocasio-Cortez's testimony today. It has been very illuminating." The chairman nodded. Kennedy made as if to stand, then appeared to think of something. He looked back. He held up one hand to the chairman. "Mr. Chairman, if I could have just 30 more seconds to make a closing observation." The chairman nodded again. Kennedy turned to face Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez directly. The grandfather expression had not disappeared, but it had been joined by something else, something clear and serious and without performance. "Ms. Ocasio-Cortez," he said, "I want to thank you sincerely for your testimony today. You have been revealing, just not in the way you probably intended when you came here this morning." He paused. "You came here to tell us about your Green New Deal and to make the case for why we should support it. But when I asked what it costs, you could not tell me. When I asked about the Amazon deal, you demonstrated that you did not understand the difference between tax breaks and government spending. When I asked about unemployment, you showed that you do not know how unemployment statistics are calculated. When I asked about Medicare for all, you could not show me the math for how to pay for it. And when I asked about your legislative record, you could not name a single major accomplishment." His voice remained gentle. His eyes did not. "I think you are a genuinely talented communicator," he said. "You are exceptional at social media. You know how to capture attention, how to generate emotion, how to make people feel that a cause is urgent and important and worth fighting for. Those are real skills." He paused. "But they are not governing skills. They are marketing skills. There is a significant difference between those two things, and I think the American people deserve to understand that difference." He picked up his papers slowly, unhurried. a man who has finished his work and knows it. There is a difference, he said, between sounding smart and being prepared, between having a vision and knowing how to implement it, between Twitter and legislation, between inspiring people and governing them. Today, in this hearing room, in front of this committee, on the record, on camera, you have shown us which side of each of those differences you currently occupy. He stood. He remained courteous. He remained Southern. He remained, to all outward appearances, the simple country lawyer from Louisiana who had wandered into the Senate and was doing his best to keep up. I am just a simple lawyer from Louisiana, he said, and his voice had just a trace of something in it, barely perceptible, that might have been the distant cousin of amusement. But even I know this much. Before you propose transforming the entire American economy, you should probably know what it costs. Before you lecture other people about economics, you should probably understand the basic concepts yourself. And before you ask the American people to trust your judgment on matters of enormous national consequence, you should probably demonstrate that you have some. He nodded to the chairman. I yield back my time. The room erupted. Not in a movie way. Not in an orchestrated way. In the messy, uncoordinated, involuntary way that rooms erupt when something real has just happened, and people are responding to it before they have had time to think about how they should respond. Republicans applauded. Some stood. Several staffers in the back of the room were already on their phones. A journalist near the front was typing rapidly with both thumbs. A lobbyist in the middle row was leaning over to speak quietly but urgently to the colleague beside him. In the Democratic section of the dais, several senators sat with carefully arranged neutral expressions that communicated, to anyone practiced at reading such expressions, a complex mixture of discomfort and private agreement. And at the witness table, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sat. She sat with the particular stillness of a person who is working very hard at not showing what they are feeling. Her hands were folded on the table in front of her. Her expression was composed. Her eyes were fixed on the middle distance. She looked, to a casual observer, like a person who is fine. She looked, to a more careful observer, like a person who is using a very significant amount of energy to look like a person who is fine. She had come into this room expecting to testify about her vision for America. She had expected to be questioned by people who might disagree with her, but who would at least meet her on the terrain she had chosen, the terrain of moral urgency and historical necessity, and the sweeping ambitions of a generation that understood what was at stake. She had not expected to be met on the terrain of basic arithmetic. She had not expected the simple country lawyer to turn out to be a Rhodes Scholar, who had spent the morning cataloging every instance in which her public statements had outrun her actual knowledge of the subject. That was the thing about John Kennedy that his opponents consistently failed to understand until it was too late. The folksy manner was not an affectation in the sense of being fake. It was genuinely part of who he was, the product of a lifetime spent in Louisiana, steeped in a culture that valued storytelling and warmth and the pleasures of conversation conducted without hurry. But the folksy manner was also, simultaneously, a technique, a precisely calibrated technique developed over decades of legal practice and political combat. The simple country lawyer was real. The Rhodes Scholar was also real. Kennedy had the remarkable ability to be both of those things at once, and to deploy whichever of them served his purposes at any given moment. In this case, his purposes had been served by 5 minutes of simple questions. That was all it had taken. 5 minutes of asking what things cost and how they worked and whether the numbers added up. 5 minutes of pressing, gently, firmly, without anger or mockery, for actual answers instead of inspirational visions. 5 minutes of treating the policy proposals of one of the most famous members of Congress in the country as things that deserved to be examined rather than merely celebrated. The clip was online before the hearing had even officially concluded. Someone in the gallery had been recording on their phone, though of course the C-SPAN footage was already being processed for upload. Within 20 minutes, 6 different versions had been posted to Twitter. Within an hour, the clip was the most watched thing on YouTube. Within 3 hours, it had been featured on every major news network's website. Within 6 hours, it was being discussed in languages other than English, in countries on the other side of the world. by people who had no particular stake in American domestic policy debates, but who found something universally compelling in the sight of a simple question, meeting an unprepared answer in real time. The conservative media response was swift and comprehensive and deeply satisfied. Fox News ran the clip on continuous rotation for the better part of 2 days. Commentators called it a masterclass in cross-examination. Legal scholars appeared on panels to analyze Kennedy's technique, pointing out how he had built a methodical, sequential case rather than going for the dramatic single kill, how each question had built on the previous one, how the accumulated weight of 5 minutes of unanswered simple questions had been far more devastating than any single sharp attack could have been. Sean Hannity called it the most effective 5 minutes of congressional questioning he had ever witnessed. Former prosecutors appeared on various programs to talk about the specific techniques Kennedy had used, the way he had established facts before building to a conclusion, the way he had let Ocasio-Cortez's own words become the instrument of her undoing, the way he had maintained perfect courtesy throughout, never giving her an opening to reframe the exchange as an attack that she was bravely resisting rather than a line of questioning she was failing to answer. Talk radio spent days on it. Rush Limbaugh, in one of his final broadcasts before his death, called it the most devastating exposure of the intellectual emptiness of progressive policy making that he had witnessed in years on the air. Local conservative hosts in markets across America played the audio in their morning shows, using Kennedy's drawl and Ocasio-Cortez's pauses as bumpers and transitions, making the sound of the exchange familiar to millions of commuters who would never have watched C-SPAN but who could not escape this clip. The mainstream media coverage was more complicated but no less extensive. CNN covered it extensively, giving significant airtime to progressive commentators who argued that Kennedy had been condescending, that the simple country lawyer routine was itself a form of disrespect, that demanding specific cost figures for ambitious proposals was a fundamentally bad faith exercise designed to make any progressive legislation seem irresponsible. These defenses were made with passion and some analytical sophistication, and they would have been more persuasive if the actual video had not been immediately available for anyone to watch. Anyone who watched the video could see that Kennedy had been unfailingly polite. Anyone who watched the video could see that his questions were genuinely simple. Anyone who watched the video could see that Ocasio-Cortez had not been able to answer them. The defense that Kennedy had been mean fell apart against the evidence of his actual behavior. The defense that his questions had been unfair fell apart against the evidence that they were questions any serious policy advocate should have been able to answer in her sleep. MSNBC's coverage was divided. Some hosts defended Ocasio-Cortez vigorously, arguing that she had been set up, that the hearing had been designed to embarrass rather than illuminate, that Republican senators never faced the same level of scrutiny for the costs and implementation mechanisms of their own policy proposals. Other MSNBC analysts, particularly those with more centrist political orientations, were considerably less generous. One of them, in a segment that itself went somewhat viral, said simply that she walked into a room without doing her homework and a man who had done his homework asked her questions about it, and those questions revealed what she had not done. That is not a scandal. That is a consequence. Democrats in Congress were largely silent publicly. Privately, the story was different. Multiple Democratic aides and members, speaking without attribution to reporters from various outlets, expressed frustration and embarrassment. Several of them had been warning for months that Ocasio-Cortez's communication style, her comfort with bold declarative statements and her relative discomfort with technical policy details, was going to create a problem eventually. The Kennedy hearing was that problem, arrived at last, more publicly and completely than most of them had feared it might. Campaign operatives working for moderate Democratic incumbents in competitive districts began receiving urgent calls from their candidates about the clip. The candidates wanted to distance themselves from it. They wanted to make clear that they were not like this, that they believed in understanding policy details before proposing them, that they could answer simple questions about cost and implementation. Several of them arranged interviews and town halls in the days following the hearing, specifically to demonstrate their command of policy specifics. A tacit acknowledgement that the Kennedy-Ocasio-Cortez exchange had created an urgent political need for Democrats to show they had done their homework. The Green New Deal, which had already been in political difficulty, became nearly untouchable among mainstream Democrats after the hearing. Candidates who had been cautiously supportive of the proposal's general direction became suddenly and carefully unavailable for comment on it. The words Green New Deal disappeared from Democratic campaign materials across the country with remarkable speed. In their place appeared careful, hedged language about investing in renewable energy, promoting energy independence, supporting clean technology innovation, language that gestured in the direction of Ocasio-Cortez's vision, without attaching itself to the specific proposal whose cost her most prominent advocate could not explain to a Senate committee. The Amazon story resonated beyond the immediate context of the hearing because it was, in a strange way, the most accessible part of Kennedy's questioning. The distinction between tax breaks and government spending is a genuinely important conceptual point that many people, even educated and politically engaged people, do not understand clearly. Kennedy had explained it with his pen and paper in terms that anyone with a basic familiarity with arithmetic could follow. You had $27 billion coming in, minus $3 billion in tax breaks, which gives you $24 billion. Amazon left. Now you have zero. The simplicity of that arithmetic made it stick in ways that more complex economic arguments rarely do. For weeks after the hearing, that specific exchange was being cited in economic policy discussions as an illustration of a fundamental confusion that pervades public debate about tax incentives. Several economists wrote pieces in various publications using the Kennedy-Ocasio-Cortez exchange as a teaching moment about the difference between tax expenditures and direct spending. A number of business schools used it in their economics and public policy courses. Whatever else the exchange had accomplished, it had produced a remarkably durable lesson in basic public finance that was now being absorbed by hundreds of thousands of people who would never have thought to learn it in any other way. Ocasio-Cortez herself tried, in the days after the hearing, to reframe what had happened. She gave interviews in which she argued that Kennedy had been interested in scoring political points rather than genuine policy engagement. She argued that the framing of her answers had been deliberately taken out of context. She argued that demanding specific cost figures for proposals that were by nature proposals and not fully drafted legislation was itself a form of bad faith. These arguments found some traction among her existing base of supporters. They did not find much traction elsewhere. The problem was the video. The problem was always the video. Whatever she said about it, anyone could watch it. Anyone could see her not answering the question about what the Green New Deal costs. Anyone could see her admitting, quietly, that Amazon's departure had not left New York with $3 billion to spend. Anyone could see the silence after Kennedy asked how to pay for $32 trillion. The video was always there, patient and unalterable, waiting to contradict whatever alternative narrative was offered. 6 months after the hearing, polling conducted for several political organizations showed measurable movement in Ocasio-Cortez's public standing. Her favorability ratings among independent voters had dropped by double digits. Among Democrats, she remained enormously popular with the progressive base, but her standing with moderate party members had declined significantly. Perhaps more important than the numbers, her role within the Democratic caucus appeared to have changed in subtle but significant ways. She was still one of the most famous members of Congress. She was still capable of generating enormous enthusiasm among progressive activists. But the easy confidence with which she had previously sailed through policy discussions, the readiness to make sweeping claims about economic transformation without worrying too much about the arithmetic, had been replaced by something more careful, more hedged, more guarded. When she spoke about policy, she was noticeably more likely to stay at the level of general principle rather than drilling into specifics. When she was asked about costs and implementation, she was more likely to defer to other experts, to cite studies, to avoid the direct declarative confidence that had been her most distinctive rhetorical feature. Kennedy, for his part, became something new in American political culture after that hearing. He had been a known quantity in Washington, respected by colleagues on both sides of the aisle, admired by people who paid close attention to Senate hearings. After the Ocasio-Cortez exchange, he became something considerably larger than that. Young conservatives who had never watched a Senate hearing in their lives found his questioning style through the viral clips and became enthusiastic advocates for it. "Just ask them what it costs" became a slogan that appeared on t-shirts and hats and social media profiles across the conservative internet. "Show me." The math became a standard response to ambitious progressive proposals. Kennedy himself leaned into the phenomenon, using his signature style in subsequent hearings with great deliberateness, asking his simple questions of witnesses advocating for expensive programs, maintaining his grandfatherly demeanor while methodically establishing that many of the people proposing to remake the American economy had not done the basic arithmetic required to understand whether their proposals were financially coherent. What made this all so strange, so worth examining carefully, was the fundamental simplicity of what Kennedy had done. He had not invented a new form of argument. He had not deployed some sophisticated rhetorical technique that required special training. He had not won through superior intelligence or deeper knowledge of obscure policy details. He had won by doing the thing that we teach children to do before they stand up in front of the class to present their project. He had done his homework. He had read the material. He had identified the things he did not yet understand and found answers to them. He had prepared specific questions, and then he had asked those questions and waited for answers. That Ocasio-Cortez could not provide those answers was not, at bottom, a reflection of her intelligence. She was clearly an intelligent person. It was a reflection of something else, something that her particular path to political prominence had perhaps made it too easy to avoid. She had risen to national fame through social media, through the power of a story, through the emotional force of her public persona, through the authenticity and passion she brought to her advocacy. None of that required her to know what things cost. None of that required her to understand the mechanics of tax policy or the calculation of unemployment statistics. The platforms on which she had built her following rewarded the quality of her communication, the feeling it generated, the community it created, the sense of shared purpose and righteous cause it conveyed. They did not reward, in any systematic way, the accuracy of the technical claims embedded in that communication. In a hearing room, the rewards were different. In a hearing room, with a former Rhodes Scholar sitting across from you at the dais, the rewards were entirely different. In that environment, the currency was not emotional resonance or cultural identity or viral potential. The currency was knowing, specifically and accurately, what you were talking about when you talked about the things you had been publicly proposing to do with the American economy for the past several years. John Kennedy had brought that currency to the hearing room in sufficient quantity. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had not. And the exchange that resulted, those 5 minutes of simple questions and insufficient answers, had told a story about preparation and ambition, and the difference between them that millions of people, across every political orientation, had found compelling enough to watch and share and discuss and argue about for months. The simple country lawyer had played dumb until the exact right moment, and then he had been, very quietly, completely devastating. Not because he was cruel, not because he was brilliant in some way that transcended normal human capacity, but because he had done the work, because he had sat in his office that morning with his staff and his notes and his list of simple questions, and had prepared the way a serious person prepares when something important is at stake. In Washington, in the end, that is what the difference looks like. Not the speeches or the social media or the magazine profiles. The difference, when it finally arrives and makes itself visible, looks like 5 minutes of simple questions and a very quiet room. If you believe that knowing what things cost matters before proposing to spend the public's money, share this story with someone who needs to hear it. If you think the difference between communication skill and governing skill is one that voters deserve to understand, share this story. If you believe that preparation is not optional for people who want the authority to reshape the lives of 330 million Americans, share this story. Because what happened in that hearing room was not just a political moment. It was a lesson about the kind of accountability that democracy requires, delivered by a simple country lawyer who was not simple at all, to a brilliant communicator who had not yet learned that brilliance in communication and preparation in policy are not the same thing, and that in the rooms where the real decisions get made, only one of those two things is enough.